Sharon Epstead is a professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Her interests are in social movements, religion, and civil resistance studies. She is the author of numerous articles and 4 books, including Nonviolent Struggle, Theory, Strategies, and Dynamics, Nonviolent Revolutions, Religion and War Resistance in the Plowshares Movement, and Convictions of the Soul. She has been a visiting scholar at Princeton Center for the Study of Religion and at Notre Dame University's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And with that, I will now pass full control over to Sharon, and she will begin her presentation.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining me today as I explore the question of the role of religious elites in civil resistance struggles, particularly in Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador in the 1970s. The field of nonviolent studies has done a great deal of research on the question of movement outcomes, and that's really the question of what factors influence whether civil resistors win or lose. And these studies have shown us that many factors can make a difference: the degree of movement participation, the extent of political opportunities, the duration of a struggle, and the degree of tactical innovation and resilience within a movement. Now, many of these strategic models emphasize that there are 2 parts to a campaign. On the one hand, there are the campaigns that civil resistors themselves undertake in which they're withholding their own forms of citizen power, such as their skills, their material resources, their obedience. But the second part of it is targeting the regime's pillars of support. These pillars, the institutions or sectors that provide various forms of power to a regime, can include the business community, education, the media, the military, and religious groups. So the overall plan is to combine civil resistor campaigns with these targets at the pillars of support. Now, we do know a little bit about how elites within these pillars of support, these important institutions, come to cut ties to the regime and side with the movement. And perhaps we know most about the role of the military. There have been a number of studies about how military elites effect and side with the opposition. We also know that this is really important. In Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's 2011 book, Why Civil Resistance Works, they give us empirical evidence that shows how important it is to win over the military. They found that civil resistors' chances of winning increase 42 times if they manage to induce defections. As a result of that finding, we have a number of other studies that have tried to explore the question of what makes military personnel likely to shift their allegiance. And what these studies tell us is that security forces are more likely to defect if they have no economic, ethnic, or political benefits from remaining loyal. Others have emphasized that they're more likely to side with civil resistors if they share a collective identity with the protesters. They also are more likely to side with civil resistors if they see the moral cost of loyalty to be very steep, and if they perceive that the regime's likelihood of collapse is high. So we know a little bit about how elites defect from the military, but we know less about how elites in other institutions decide to remain loyal to the state or not. For instance, what causes media leaders to air oppositional perspectives instead of simply towing the government line? What causes educational leaders to implement new curriculum that can challenge state legitimacy? What prompts business leaders to grant their support and sometimes financial resources to a movement? Now, in this presentation, I limit my analysis to the factors that cause religious leaders to denounce an incumbent regime and cast their support with civil resistance struggles. Now, you might be asking, why should we care about religious elites? What role can they play in civil resistance struggles? We know from social movement studies that religious institutional support can provide an array of resources for a movement. And we see this particularly well in the civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 60s. As a result of those studies, a number of scholars have said there are various resources that religious groups can offer to movements. For example, they can offer moral legitimation for the cause. One of the things that we have documented is that when religious leaders back a movement, it's much harder for the state to discredit activists. It's harder to portray them as kind of lunatic fringe or as troublemakers if they've got the backing of high-ranking religious officials. We also know that religion provides values or theologies that can emphasize altruism, justice, and sacrifice, important parts of a civil resistance struggle. Religious groups sometimes create free spaces where activists can build a culture of resistance. If you're trying to organize a movement in an authoritarian state, it can be very difficult to find a place to meet, to talk about strategies, to begin to build ideologies that foster resistance. And because religion in many cases has a bit of a sacred space, states are reluctant to break down the doors of a temple or a mosque or a church, and therefore sometimes religious groups can provide essential free space for organizing. Religion can also provide rituals and music that are channeled into a campaign. They can provide important financial resources. And as we saw in the civil rights movement, they can provide recruitment networks. In looking at the Montgomery bus boycott, which was organized in the span of a few days, one of the fastest ways they were able to recruit people was through the religious networks. Pastors spoke from the pulpit, had their staff make phone calls through the religious directories to motivate people to join into the boycott. Finally, we know that religious institutions tend to be innately cross-national. So religious groups are geographically dispersed, and yet they often have a shared identity that links them to people of the same faith in other parts of the world. This can be a very powerful basis for building international solidarity and support for a civil resistance movement. Because religion can matter to a civil resistance struggle, that leads me to ask the following questions that are at the core of this presentation. First of all, what factors influence whether religious leaders decide to support or oppose civil resistors? And secondly, how can religious support or opposition affect a movement and its trajectory and chances of winning? To answer these questions, I use a comparative historical method that looks at 3 different nations that experienced nonviolent struggles during the 1970s and the 1980s. But in these 3 cases, religious leaders took different positions. Using comparative historical methods, I seek to explain why the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy was largely supportive of the state in Argentina during this Dirty War period, and why the church hierarchy in Chile actually supported the movement that was trying to oust General Pinochet and the military junta and establish democracy. And the third, why the church hierarchy in El Salvador divided over the people's struggle. In order to explore these 3 cases, I'm turning to the literature to highlight several factors that I think make a difference. One of the factors that I'll be looking at is the nature of church-state relationships. And what I argue is that the state's historical relationships with religious institutions will shape the chances that religious leaders will stay loyal. So specifically, if the state has provided economic patronage to religious groups or granted religious leaders some form of influence or a position of power within the government, they're more likely to remain loyal. However, if there's been an antagonistic history, such as in the German Democratic Republic, where ministers' children were often denied the right to university education and pastors were not granted access to state housing, then I argue that religious leaders are more willing to oppose the state. So this leads to my first hypothesis. In those countries where the state provides material or political benefits to religious institutions, religious leaders are more likely to remain loyal. But when no benefits exist, religious leaders are more likely to be critical and side with civil resistors. The second factor that I look at deals with radical flanks. And civil resistance researchers have been interested in how the presence of a radical flank affects a nonviolent struggle. And the debate is whether these radical flank groups have a positive effect or a negative effect. Some argue that the presence of a radical group, either radical in its goals or in its methods of achieving that goal, has a positive effect by making civil resistors look more reasonable, more negotiation worthy. But other people argue that it can have a negative effect. And we see this, for example, in the struggle in Northern Ireland, that the presence of the armed struggle with the Irish Republican Army created a dynamic in which the state was able to portray all civil resistance as basically terrorist movements. So the question is, does the presence of a radical flank hurt or harm a movement? Now, Erica Chenoweth and Kurt Schock recently published an article in which they argued that we haven't really distinguished between radical flank groups that are ideologically oriented and those that are tactically radical. So in other words, sometimes a movement might have a more extreme goal which can benefit civil resistors by making them look like a moderate alternative. For example, Joe Freeman found that centrist feminist groups, such as the National Organization of Women, were actually strengthened when other groups like socialist or Marxist feminists arrived on the scene, because it made them look more moderate. And of course, the picture here also depicts another argument, namely that the presence of black nationalist groups, black power groups such as the Nation of Islam or the Black Panthers, actually helped Martin Luther King and the civil resistance struggle. In fact, some scholars purport that Malcolm X even recognized this factor and basically felt that his greatest contribution to the civil rights movement was to continue to be that militant threat that made Martin Luther King look like the person to negotiate with, who made him look like the goals of integration were very reasonable. But sometimes groups share the same goal, but they have different tactics to achieve that goal. So when we're looking at movement, civil resistance struggle, aiming to overturn authoritarian regimes, you may on the one hand have an armed movement that's trying to achieve that goal and a civil resistance movement. So what effect does an armed guerrilla movement have, for example, on a nonviolent movement trying to achieve democratization? Chenoweth and Schock find that there's no direct impact, but I'm arguing that the presence of a radical flank may have an indirect impact, namely of pushing religious elites to choose sides in a conflict. So this leads to my next hypothesis, which is that religious leaders are more likely to support civil resistors if there's an anti-religious radical flank, in this case Marxist groups, that are either ideologically or tactically radical. Religious leaders are more likely to support civil resistors so they don't shift towards alternatives that might threaten the future of religious institutions and groups. The third factor I'm going to look at is state repression. And what we know is that when a civilian uprising occurs, almost all regimes will use repression to try to stop it. Sometimes the state will employ highly selective forms of repression. So they'll target particular political figures or opposition figures and arrest them, imprison them, or assassinate them. But sometimes regimes take a different approach. They use massive repression, indiscriminately attacking the population in order to terrorize citizens into submission. This leads to my third hypothesis, that religious leaders are more likely to intervene on behalf of civil resistors when the state-sponsored repression is indiscriminately applied to the broader population. There are a couple reasons behind my hypothesis here. Basically, with targeted violence, I think religious leaders may feel that this is a political conflict, not a religious one. So they might tend towards a neutral position, believing that it's outside of their designated realm. But when innocent civilians are harmed, it becomes a moral issue. And religious leaders who see themselves as moral figures may feel compelled to speak out when innocent people are harmed. The final factor that I'm going to look at are the characteristics of religious leaders. And I'm inspired here by Marshall Gantz, who studied leaders in the United Farm Worker Movement. And what he found is that outsiders who came in from other unions had a very difficult time organizing farm workers. The ones who were most effective were actually the organizers who themselves shared a common socioeconomic and cultural background with the farm workers. So I'm believing that there might be some truth in this with religious leaders as well. And this leads to my fourth hypothesis, that religious leaders who come from the aggrieved sector or who have close personal connections to it are more likely to side with civil resistors. Conversely, religious elites who come from elite backgrounds and have limited contact with those who are suffering are less likely to break ties to the state. So those are the four factors I'm going to be looking at. Let's go ahead and look at the three specific cases. And I should qualify my comments here by saying we have limited time, and so I'm going through these cases very quickly. Obviously, there's much more to the history and the dynamics at play, but I want to just highlight some of the factors that I think shape religious leaders' responses. So I'll begin with Argentina's Dirty War. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina was ruled by a military junta. And this junta used brutality to eliminate any kind of leftist influences. The buildup to this authoritarian state actually began in the early 70s when the Argentine government considered itself to be part of a worldwide battle against communism. It believed that Marxism was growing within their national boundaries, and they pointed to evidence that unions were expanding, popular organizations were proliferating, and of course there was the growing influence of liberation theology. In addition, during this time period, we see the emergence of armed guerrilla groups such as the Montoneros or the Popular Revolutionary Army. So, to squash this Marxist threat, the government took a number of actions. In 1974, it passed an anti-subversive law that prohibited any type of protest or demonstrations. Next, the government charged the military with the task of eliminating the guerrilla movement. The military then acted quickly, forming death squads that targeted not just guerrillas, but organizers, human rights activists, labor activists. They also targeted clergy who were part of the Third World Peace movement that was inspired by the Vatican II Council. By March of 1976, the military had taken over and assumed power through a coup d'etat. Catholics in Argentina had a mixed response to the coup. Most of the Catholic bishops supported the military largely because they hoped that the military could stop the political chaos. But lay people had different reactions. Some of them joined the armed resistance, but many of them turned to the nonviolent movement. And what we see is that, in fact, the military did not stop the conflict. On the contrary, more and more people began organizing resistance, and the state responded by increasing its level of repression. Over the next years, security force members kidnapped, interrogated, tortured, and executed tens of thousands of civilians. An estimated 30,000 people were victimized during this period. So what position did Argentina's Catholic leaders take as the country sank into authoritarian rule? Many of the grassroots priests and seminarians opposed the military regime and its terroristic tactics, but the church hierarchy was mostly passive and quiet, refusing to denounce the ruling junta. Specifically, the Argentine Episcopacy is made up of more than 80 active leaders, including the heads of dioceses, auxiliary bishops, and military bishops. Of those 80 leaders, only 4 of them denounced the human rights violations, and others, such as Cardinal Aramburu, actually denied that there were any kidnappings or disappearances, despite the growing amount of evidence of these atrocities. What explains the Catholic leaders' ongoing support for the state during the Dirty War? Several scholars argue that it's largely connected to their history of close ties to the state and economic elites. In terms of political advantages, in the 1970s, there was still a requirement that the president of the country had to be Catholic, and there was no formal separation of church and state. So the church had a certain degree of political influence. It also received monetary support from the regime. The state had long granted significant financial support to private Catholic schools, including providing more than half the budget for Argentina's Catholic University. Yet despite these benefits, one could say that Catholic leaders should have felt compelled to speak out against the repression that was so indiscriminately applied. The reason they didn't can partly be explained by their theological views. Argentina's bishops largely ignored the progressive theological ideas that were emerging from the Vatican II Council and from liberation theology. In general, most of the bishops held the stance that the church should be neutral on public and political matters. Finally, I want to talk about the presence of the armed guerrilla movement. For many of the bishops, they saw the potential for a Marxist takeover, and they were concerned that this would mean a new state would be opposed to religion. So the presence of an armed group in this case actually pushed religious elites to support the state rather than the civil resistance struggle. Let's turn now to Chile and the struggle to oust General Pinochet and the military junta. Chile's authoritarian regime began when the military overthrew democratically elected President Salvador Allende in September of 1973. A ruling military junta took power, headed by Army General Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet immediately began a search and destroy mission to root out any kind of leftist influence. An estimated 50,000 Allende supporters were arrested and detained and held in the National Stadium, which was transformed into a detention center in the weeks following the coup. According to a U.S. State Department report, an estimated 10,800 civilians were killed in the first 3 months of military rule. This state of repression actually became a permanent state as Pinochet set up the Directorate for National Intelligence, whose primary mission was to eliminate any political dissidents. Chileans responded quickly, though, resisting the regime and trying to assist its victims. The very first group to emerge was the Committee for Peace. Under the Santiago Archdiocese domain, this committee was offering material assistance and legal aid to those who were politically persecuted. And within the first few months, Committee for Peace lawyers had responded to 1,300 requests for help. So as they were working with these people, they were collecting evidence from these cases, and this included evidence of torture. They passed this information on to Chile's bishops, and the bishops denounced the regime's interrogation abuses and its practice of detaining people without charges. This marked the very first time that the Catholic Church publicly critiqued the military junta. In 1975, after the committee had processed more than 18,000 cases, the Catholic hierarchy made it clear that they were taking an official stand on the side of the civil resistance movement. They stated that the church could not remain passive or neutral in light of these abuses. Now, the military junta did find a way to shut down the Committee for Peace, but what the Catholic Church did is it just opened up new opposition groups, including organizations such as the Association for Families of Those Who Were Executed for Political Reasons. One of the other things the Catholic Church did is it provided financial support for these various human rights and civil resistance groups. It actually channeled tens of millions of dollars in financial aid and material support from Catholic groups and religious organizations in Europe and North America. But why were Catholic religious leaders willing to cut their ties to the Pinochet regime in contrast to their Argentine counterparts? There are several reasons. First, in contrast to Argentina, the church had formally separated from the state and received no benefits from supporting the regime. Second, there was a long-standing social justice tradition within the Chilean church, and this stems from the historical appointment of progressive bishops. These progressive church leaders had embraced the theology of liberation and particularly the preferential option for the poor. In fact, the Chilean church had even experimented with these ideas by redistributing their own church lands to the poor. Third, while there was an armed movement that emerged, its size and power was really quite limited in Chile. Mostly, this armed group was destroying electrical towers and transportation systems. So compared to the Montoneros in Argentina or El Salvador's guerrilla movement, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the armed movement in Chile really did not pose a significant threat, and therefore the leaders may have felt that it wasn't necessary to support a police state that would eliminate this Marxist group. Finally, several of the key leaders in the Chilean hierarchy had a long-standing involvement with the most marginalized sectors of Chilean society. For example, Bishop Silva Enriquez had served as the headmaster of a Catholic school whose mission was to educate families that were economically marginalized. He'd also worked with Catholic relief services, assisting refugees and prisoners. But the event that really affected him was when he went to the National Stadium right after the coup, and he visited some of the 50,000 people who were considered subversives and were being detained. When he visited the stadium and talked with these detainees, they recounted experiences of torture, and they begged him for legal help. These encounters with the persecuted and the marginalized were a key part of the reason why Catholic leaders in Chile sided with the civil resistance struggle. Finally, we turn to El Salvador's liberation struggle. By the 1970s, political tensions in El Salvador had been brewing for years, and they resulted largely from the tremendous economic and social inequalities in the country. To address these problems, various peasant and labor organizations had organized and were demanding better work conditions, livable wages, and land reform. These organizations eventually coalesced into a popular opposition movement that demanded progressive political transformation. Not surprisingly, the state responded with massive repression, and anyone associated with these groups was often targeted by death squads who would abduct and execute union organizers, base Christian community leaders, human rights workers, but also their family members, their colleagues, their neighbors. So the repression was really indiscriminate. This repression intensified through the late 70s when between 500 and 800 civilians were murdered each month. Now, a growing number of Salvadorans responded by joining the armed forces known as the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. And as a result, the country quickly became embroiled in civil war. So to deal with this conflict, the Vatican very carefully selected a new archbishop in 1977. Oscar Romero was seen as a neutral choice, since he had always emphasized personal piety and salvation, but not social change. So most people expected that he was just going to ignore the political chaos. That was not the case. Shortly after he was inaugurated, a close friend of Romero's, Father Rutilio Grande, was assassinated by death squads, and this opened the archbishop's eyes to the violence. Romero stated, "It was Father Grande's murder that gave me the impetus to put into practice the principles of Vatican II, which call for solidarity with the suffering masses and the poor." As Romero spoke out against the state-sponsored violence, more Salvadorans came forward, telling the Archbishop their stories of family members who had been abducted, kidnapped, tortured, and killed. As a result, Romero began to speak out even further, critiquing the regime, demanding that it stop the repression and implement reform. But not all the Catholic leaders agreed with Romero's convictions. In fact, the Salvadoran Conference of Bishops was seriously divided over the position that the church should take vis-a-vis this conflict. Several of the bishops were so opposed to Romero's support of the liberation struggle that they complained to the Vatican, and the Vatican then sent a representative who convened a meeting with all of Salvador's bishops. Romero explained at this meeting how he was leading the church in a direction that would support civil resistance, but 4 of the country's 5 bishops were adamantly opposed to that direction. Romero's support for the civil resistance struggle came at a high cost. The military eventually came to see him as an enemy of the state, and ultimately they treated him like any other Salvadorans who were deemed subversive. On March 24th of 1980, Archbishop Romero was assassinated by a government-sponsored death squad. He was shot while celebrating Mass. So what explains this divided or mixed response by the religious elites in El Salvador? What we know is that El Salvador did not receive any overt patronage from the government, but individual religious leaders did have various positions of influence. For instance, Bishop Alvarez was a chaplain and a colonel in the military, and he had a certain degree of power in that institution. Other bishops had personal ties to economic and political elites. For instance, Monsignor Aparicio had a large hacienda that had been given to him by the former president Arturo Molina. He was well known for sharing the political views of all the large landowners in El Salvador. But on the other hand, there was a tradition within the Salvadoran church of religious leaders supporting peasants and unions and human rights workers. So Romero's predecessor, Archbishop Luis Chavez y Gonzalez, had encouraged the priests to move into the countryside and to work on implementing the ideas of the Vatican II Council that stated a preferential option for the poor. Since the religious institution didn't receive any direct benefits from the state, and since all the bishops were aware of the indiscriminate violence that was occurring, the real explanation that I think explains why some leaders cut ties to the regime was found in their personal experiences and their personal traits. The 2 bishops that supported the civil resistance struggle were Romero and Archbishop Rivera y Damas. Not surprisingly, these 2 had more direct contact with Salvadorans who were oppressed by the state. But I want to emphasize that their contact with the poor and oppressed was not a result of a pre-existing commitment to liberation theology. In fact, Romero initially was quite critical of liberation theology. Their connection to the poor came as they began interacting with peasants and human rights workers and learning about their experiences. And for Romero, of course, the transformative event was the assassination of his colleague and friend Rutilio Grande. For Bishop Rivera, he had begun to criticize the state in 1970 when one priest, Father Jose Alas, had been abducted and tortured after speaking out for land reform. And then later that same year, Father Nicolas Rodriguez was assassinated by the regime. This led Bishop Rivera y Damas to publicly condemn the murder and call it a political crime. So both of the 2 bishops who were opposed to the state had close ties to those who were suffering from the violence. Now let's turn to kind of a comparison of all 3 cases. Looking comparatively, we can look at how these factors may have shaped the outcomes of these struggles. Based on the 3 cases, religious leaders may be more willing to remain loyal, or at least to withhold public criticism, when they do have financial and political benefits from the state, as was the case in Argentina. But in Chile and El Salvador, the church as an institution did not have any official roles with the government or receive material remuneration. So this indicates some support for hypothesis 1, although it's clear that that's not enough to explain why religious elites sometimes break their ties to the state. If we look at radical flank effects, we can see that hypothesis 2 focuses on whether or not this affects elite decisions. We had guerrilla movements in all 3 countries, but Chile's revolutionary movement was far weaker than in Argentina or Salvador, and therefore it posed less of a serious threat to the state. That may have led Chilean religious leaders to be less concerned about a potential takeover and more inclined then to break ties to the regime. But what I find interesting here is that the presence of an armed guerrilla group has different effects. So in Argentina, the effect it had was to lead bishops to say, we need to support the military, we need to support their efforts to stop a Cuban-style revolution. But in El Salvador, at least 2 of the bishops said, because of the armed movement, we really need to side with the civil resistance struggle. We need to allow people to join that movement and to fight for their causes, because if we don't give them that option, they're more likely to turn to the armed guerrilla movement. So the presence of a radical flank can have either effect, And so there's not unequivocal support for my second hypothesis. If we look at state repression, I anticipated that the indiscriminate repression would yield a critical response from religious elites who would feel compelled as moral leaders to respond to these egregious acts. But again, we had indiscriminate violence in all three cases. In Chile, religious elites did speak out against the abuses. In Argentina, the religious elites denied that they were even occurring. And in El Salvador, some said these abuses aren't good, but they're justifiable in the struggle to eliminate a Marxist opposition to the church. So the presence of widespread repression doesn't automatically translate to religious defections from the regime. Finally, I want to look at the extent of personal ties that religious elites had to suffering. And I think this factor really does distinguish whether or not religious leaders side with the movement or side with the state. It's clear that in Argentina, most of the religious leaders had ties to the state and others. In Chile, there was a close connection to the people suffering. And in El Salvador, people divided, the religious leaders divided over whether or not they had ties to those suffering most. So let me turn now to the second question. How does the support of a religious institution affect a nonviolent struggle? Here we can focus on Chile and El Salvador. And what we can see is, particularly in these cases, the church served a very important role as being the center of transnational networks. What we know in Chile is many Catholics in Europe and in North America began to send down material support, financial contributions that helped to sustain civil resistance organizations. But we also see that that shared identity facilitated international solidarity. This is particularly true in El Salvador, as people within the United States who are Catholic, but also from other faith traditions, wanted to support the Catholic Church's connection to the poor and their struggle. So the transnational networks were very effective at mobilizing U.S. citizens who largely expressed their solidarity by trying to challenge the U.S. government to change its foreign policy and no longer provide arms and military support that fueled that civil war. In both Chile and El Salvador, we see that the religious institutions did provide free space. In El Salvador, it was in based Christian communities. In Chile, also, they were training leaders. They were providing a place where a culture of resistance could be developed and flourish. Third, we also see that this theology of liberation provided moral justification and inspiration for the movement. So having the support of religious leaders, in part or in full, was useful to the civil resistance struggles in those two cases. In Argentina, obviously, they didn't receive these benefits, and there were fewer free spaces for people to organize. Most of that organizing happened on university campuses, and there was less protection for the students. We also see that it was harder for the civil resistance struggle to get its message out because key religious leaders were denying that there were any human rights abuses. Let me conclude then by talking about the lessons we can glean for civil resistors. I think there are 4 lessons. The first is that civil resistors should take a look at this pillar of support for the regime and ask, first of all, whether or not these institutions receive patronage or benefit from the state, because that's going to affect the likelihood that they'll remain loyal. If there are no forms of patronage or no real significant benefits, they might well be an important ally, and efforts should be made to win over their support. I also think that civil resistors should make conscientious efforts to remind religious elites of their role as moral leaders. They should encourage religious leaders to take a public stand on state repression and human rights abuses. They should remind them that their role is as guardians of the vulnerable, champions of the oppressed. Third, civil resistors can revive religious emphases that exist in every major world tradition that focus on social justice. Every time they can say there is a tradition in which our religion doesn't purely address personal spirituality, but also the economic and political conditions that affect the individuals who are part of those traditions. Finally, I think perhaps one of the most effective techniques is that civil resistors should facilitate and orchestrate encounters between religious elites and those who are suffering from the injustices. It's in those encounters, those personal connections, that a human face is put on the struggle, that religious elites come to understand the source of repression and the need for social change. So even though I think we need further research on this topic, exploring how this might play out in other religious traditions such as Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, or Hinduism, it's clear that having the support of religious leaders can be useful, and therefore it's an area that merits further study. So with that, I'll bring my presentation to a close and open it up for questions and discussion.
And the first question, Sharon, somebody says, I have a question concerning the Jesuit order. How would you characterize their type of attitude? Did they behave according to the national pattern that you explained, or would you say that the Jesuits had a common approach in all of those countries?
Can you repeat the last part of it? Did the Jesuits have a common, pardon me?
Did they behave according to the national pattern that you explained, or would you say that the Jesuits had a common approach in all of those countries?
Well, certainly we know the most about the role of the Jesuits in El Salvador because they played a very active role and paid a very high price for it. We know of the Jesuits at the University of Central America who were killed because of their stance of support for the liberation movement. And I do think one of the important factors here, if we look at the civil resistance movement, and in each of these cases, there are political factors that matter, but there are also theological factors that matter. And in some ways, my presentation is oversimplifying the Catholic Church, which of course is a diverse institution. Even though it may have one tradition and one set of theological teachings, groups like the Jesuits are going to emphasize certain teachings over other ones, and we see that there's great variation. And within the Catholic Church, there are some people who will indeed embrace this emphasis on social justice, and others who see their role as much more spiritual leaders. So in terms of the Jesuit order, they have that theological tradition and that historical tradition of emphasizing social justice, of being in solidarity with the poor, with the marginalized, with the oppressed. We see it very clearly in El Salvador, and I think in the other countries, in Argentina, it's a little bit more mixed. Many bishops were opposed to the state there, but felt that they really had no power to affect it. And so they didn't speak out, thinking it really wasn't going to make a difference, or if they did speak out, there would be no real audience who would hear it. So you can find individual Jesuits in all of these cases who kind of had a pattern of always siding with the poor, but collectively they had the greatest impact in El Salvador and the least impact in Argentina. But it is important to recognize the diversity within the Catholic Church, and that Jesuits clearly were much more likely to side with civil resistors than other religious traditions.
All right, great. It looks like we have a few people who have their hands raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Eli, can you ask Sharon your question, please?
Sure. Thanks for the great presentation. My question is about if you know to what degree there is an impact on religious elites' support for civil resistance based on how much their churches have previously been promoting the development of nonviolent habits or skills within their church communities, so whether they're trainings or they're preaching about it, etc. Do you have any insight on that?
We do see in some countries the church taking a much more active role in promoting nonviolence trainings. And I think the clearest example of this is in the Philippines in 1986 in the people power struggle, that you have Cardinal Sin actually inviting in the International Fellowship of Reconciliation and saying, go to parish, to parish, to parish, and train people in this method, and then help us figure out how we take this knowledge and actually implement it in the struggle to oust Ferdinand Marcos. And it was very clear that that made a difference. Now, of course, I think one of the factors we have to look at is in many of these countries, the proportion of people who subscribe to a particular religious tradition is very high. So in the Philippines at the time of the people power movement, you have close to 90% of the population that identifies as Roman Catholic. And so the influence of the church there in promoting nonviolence is going to be greater than in a country that is very religiously diverse. Same is true. I mean, one of the reasons I picked these three cases, I'm trying to hold other factors constant that might have affected the outcome. And so I wanted three cases that had different outcomes, but that had similar scope conditions. So in Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador, these are very, very Catholic countries. In fact, if I can find my statistics here, at the time of these struggles, 76% of Chileans were Roman Catholic. In Argentina, 91% of the population was Roman Catholic, and 93% of Salvadorans were. So what you have is a situation in which a large majority of the population identifies, and when the church then promotes this, it's more likely to have an impact. Do we have a lot of evidence over how much the church was training for nonviolence? We have less evidence in these cases than we do, for example, in East Germany in 1989 or in the Philippines in 1986. Certainly we know there were trainings that were going on in base Christian communities. So one of the effects of Vatican II was to say, we've lost the masses. We don't have enough priests and members of religious orders to address all of the needs. So let's train lay leaders to hold worship services and Bible studies in their local communities. And as they trained these lay leaders, they gave them not just training in theological leadership, but they also taught them how to be community organizers. And part of that was, how do you organize a movement? How do you implement the ideas of civil resistance? It varied. In some cases that included an emphasis on nonviolence. In some cases it was more of a straightforward social movements community organizing approach that used nonviolent tactics without necessarily the philosophy of nonviolence. It would be a fascinating question to see how much was actually done prior to the emergence of these movements and if that had a different impact. I don't actually have that data, but we do know that this is another role that religion can play in terms of getting out the ideas of nonviolence that may be essential then, not only in the emergence of movements, but maintaining nonviolent discipline when the conflict escalates.
All right, great. Somebody asks, Erica Chenoweth's work shows that outside actors engaging in nonviolent civil resistance may lessen the effectiveness of the outcome. When the church provides a transitional network, does that affect the outcome positively or negatively?
This is a very important question, and I'm very glad that Erica Chenoweth is taking it on, because I think it's a complicated question about what role do outside actors play. In my previous work, I've actually argued that the international community can do more harm than help in some civil resistance struggles. The difference in these cases, I think, is that a transnational network combines insiders and outsiders. So it's a different case when you have the international community coming in saying, we're going to impose sanctions unless you make these changes. What's happened in these countries, in Chile and El Salvador, is people within the churches in those nations began to say, we need some support, we need solidarity, we need our brothers and sisters in our common Christian faith to support us. And there was very clear, especially out of Central America, not just El Salvador, but in Guatemala and in Nicaragua, you had a very clear impulse from those in those countries saying to their counterparts in the international sphere, this is what we want you to do. We don't want you to come in and tell us how to run our movements. We don't want you to impose sanctions. What we want you to do is try to work within your own countries to change foreign policy. So for example, in El Salvador, the United States was sending all sorts of military aid. They were training the militaries, as we know from now the movement for the School of the Americas, but they were also sending a lot of weapons to the military in El Salvador. And of course, the U.S. government was sponsoring the military regime in the name of fighting the Cold War. So what religious actors did in El Salvador and in Nicaragua and it was to say, here is your role. We need you to help us. The fellow Catholics in Europe and in the United States, we need you to help us, but we don't want you to dictate or direct the movement. Your role is to figure out the roots of this conflict that you have some influence over. So it was very much emphasized that, for example, solidarity activists in the United States should try to get the U.S. government to stop sending weapons to El Salvador, to stop sending financial support. They said it's going to be hard for the state to continue waging this civil war if it doesn't have allies and the material resources that it needs to do so. So that's different, in my opinion, than having outside actors kind of come in and impose their own self-directed sanctions or their own types of actions. And I think that is highly problematic when that occurs. If the international community takes action without consulting with civil resistors on the ground, you see a shift in the locus of power. And the international community is not always in the best position to make those decisions. Those decisions should be made by the local civil resistors. So in some ways, these cases are exemplary because the notion of solidarity was stated that your role is to accompany us. And when we tell you we need help in stopping the shipment of weapons from the United States, that's your task. Your role is not to impose your own ideas here, but to simply be with us in this struggle. So in that sense, I don't see this as outside actors being involved. I see it as activating people in other countries to act in solidarity by addressing the international roots that contributed to that conflict. And that's an important difference to my mind.
All right, great. Somebody asks, can you explain a bit more about the use of the word moral to talk about religious elites and their role? Morality is such an elastic word. What's morally good for one group or people may be reprehensible to another. This is especially true in with the use of force or violence. Religious elites within their own traditions are divided on this. Calling religious elites to take moral leadership begs the question of whose morality is desired. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, and this is why I think it's important that when civil resistors make appeals to religious elites, it's linked to a particular theological tradition, such as liberation theology or the theology of resistance or the theology of nonviolence, because that's absolutely the case that people could say it's completely morally justifiable to pick up a weapon and try to overthrow the state because we're protecting innocents who are harmed or we're trying to create a more just society. So pretty much everybody in a conflict believes that they have a moral cause and believes that they're morally justified in taking action. I think what civil resistors need to do is learn to speak the language of the religious elites. And fortunately, we have great examples of this. If you read Martin Luther King Jr., he's brilliant at situating his appeals based on kind of the political and the religious orientations of his audience. So the letter from Birmingham jail is written to local pastors and rabbis who had critiqued his use of nonviolent direct action. And the whole letter is couched within a theological biblical tradition. So he gives examples from the Bible in which nonviolent direct action had been used, in which people had implemented civil disobedience for a cause. And that way what you're doing is you're couching this concept of morality within a shared worldview. Now, again, I'm oversimplifying it because if you look at something like the Catholic Church or any religious traditions, what we know is all the major world traditions have both a tradition of violence, a tradition of nonviolence, and actually also a tradition of kind of a just war, limited defense. So the same scriptures can be used to interpret different types of struggles, including kind of religiously based holy wars. But I think what's important is to use the language and the values that those religious elites themselves subscribe to say, if in fact you believe that the scripture teaches social justice, then here is how we need you to support us in the struggle for social justice. It's not going to work every time, but I think civil resistors are going to be more effective if they can speak the language of those elites they're trying to win over. Just like King was far more effective in winning over the support of local pastors by using that shared biblical language. And then he used other language at other times. So the March on Washington, he frames his appeal in terms of the values of democracy. Civil resistors really need to know how to speak the language that's relevant to the elites that they're targeting. And it's going to be different for the military, it's going to be different for teachers, it's going to be different for religious leaders or business leaders. In each case, knowing their language, knowing their values, talking about it within their traditions is a way basically to win them over. It may or may not work, but in that sense you have to kind of use the basis of morality that the religious leaders themselves understand. As I said, it may not work. In Argentina, the bishops really felt that their most moral position was to support the state because it was going to prevent a Marxist regime that would, in their mind, impose all sorts of immoral social structures. But I think, nonetheless, it behooves civil resistors to understand that language, understand the worldview, the theologies, and speak within that. It's going to increase their chances of winning support from those kinds of religious elites.
All right, great. This next question kind of plays into that. Do you think that leadership for social, political, and economical changes should come from people gathered as part of a religious group?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, sure. Do you think that leadership for social, political, and economical changes should come from people gathered as part of a religious group?
I don't think I can say unequivocally it should always come from religious groups. I think, again, this notion of accompaniment and solidarity that really emerged in the 1980s from the conflicts in Central America was important. And I think what's important is that the aggrieved population gets to direct their movement. Gandhi said this as well, that Indians have to know that they can liberate themselves without the assistance of other actors. But I think religious leaders should be responding to this. And of course, there's a long-standing tradition of recognizing that religion doesn't just speak to the spiritual needs of people, but that the spiritual needs hardly matter if people are going hungry, if they're fearful that they're going to be kidnapped and tortured and arrested, that religion has to recognize the political and economic implications of their spiritual traditions. I think the impulse for these movements should come from those who are most affected, who are most aggrieved, who are most oppressed. It may well be that it comes out of religious institutions because, as I said earlier in the presentation, often that's the only free space. Over and over again when we do these studies of authoritarian regimes and the civil resistance struggles that emerge, many times they are organizing in religious institutions because that may be the only free space available. That it's very difficult for the state to justify breaking down the doors of a mosque or breaking down the doors of a temple or of a church. And so there is a little bit of recognition that there's a sacred space, and therefore that may be the last free space that's available. So we do see that oftentimes that happens, but the impetus needs to be from those who are aggrieved, not from religious leaders who are telling them what to do. And again, if we look at, for example, the civil rights movement, yes, black ministers from black churches in the South played a very important role, but the real impetus came from other actors. So Rosa Parks provides kind of the galvanizing event that mobilizes people. She works with the ministers, but she's not certainly a religious leader in that sense, or the student sit-in movements. This comes from the population, and then religious leaders provide support for it. And I think that's essential, that it comes out of the population that's most affected by these injustices.
All right, great. Somebody else asks, would you say that religious elites function more as external actors or as movement actors themselves? How do they function as external actors, or how do they function as movement actors?
I think it varies across the cases. I think in some of these instances, such as Chile, they were initially external actors who then became, in some cases, important movement figures. But they didn't start these movements. If you look at Chile, if you look at El Salvador, they're really other groups, popular organizations that begin to organize, and often they work in tandem with religious leaders. But again, I think that's an important model, that the impulse comes from the population that wants the change, and then they work with religious leaders. So I think in most cases, religious leaders are external actors who then join the movement. Certainly this is the case with Oscar Romero, who was initially quite opposed to some of the popular organizations, but as he came to see the suffering, as he had personal encounters, more and more he got involved. You know, it's interesting, like he never supported a particular political party, he never endorsed particular groups, but he spoke out for their concerns. He didn't endorse any particular organization, but he spoke for their concerns to the point that he became basically the figure for that movement. And he was an effective figure because he's an archbishop. So people pay attention. Unfortunately, they pay more attention when a religious figure is assassinated. There were 70,000 Salvadorans who were killed in that struggle, but the ones that we hear about are Archbishop Romero, assassinated while saying Mass, the 4 North American nuns who were killed. We see that people identify with those stories in part because they identify with what those religious leaders symbolize, a certain faith tradition. And so I think in these cases, most of the time, there's a movement that then religious leaders respond to, and they may become a figure for that movement, but their role remains somewhat external. It's there to support, it's there to articulate their concerns and grievances, perhaps to facilitate international connections, but they are not necessarily the movement leaders or endorsing particular organizations or parties.
All right, great. And as we move on to our last question, I just want to remind people, if they do have any follow-up questions, they can email them to webinar@nonviolentconflict.org. And you are free to also join us on Facebook and Twitter, and we would love to engage with you. But as we close out, I'm just going to ask my last question. So is it correct to say then that you are arguing that religious elites primarily affect the state by giving the opposition movement a mobilization advantage? Or are there mechanisms by which they can influence the regime directly?
I haven't really thought about that. That's a fascinating question. I think their capacity to affect the regime directly somewhat is dependent on their relationship to the state. So if they're fairly independent, if there's a complete separation of religious institutions in the state, there's going to be less direct positions of power or direct forms of influence that they can take. I think really their power is in kind of the legitimacy they give to movements, the way they can provide a variety of essential resources that movements need. They need recruitment networks, they need moral legitimacy, they need transnational solidarity increasingly in today's world. And religion is kind of the platform that provides that. It's less, I don't see it so much as directly religious elites confronting the state. Certainly Archbishop Romero did confront the state. He did speak directly through national radio to say to the military, stop repressing the people, you should not follow orders to kill innocents. He did have kind of a direct dialogue with those state institutions, but he didn't have direct power. He had no kind of influence in the state other than kind of a moral influence. And I think that's probably most often the case, that religious actors don't have a great deal of power, although this may be true in other areas. And I think what we need is more research to explore this. So it might be a very different situation in the Middle East, in a place like Iran, where religious leaders do have kind of direct political influence into decisions made by state actors. So certainly what my research is simply a first attempt to delineate some of the factors that might make a difference. But how it plays out in particular struggles really is a reflection of the political context that they're mobilizing in and the nature of the relationship between religious institutions and the state. That could look very different in the Middle East than it looks like in Latin America or in different parts of Asia, for example. So I see this as a first step to hopefully many more research studies that will nuance our understanding about the role that religious elites can play and the most effective path that they can take to support civil resistance.
All right, great. And that takes us to about 1 hour. So this has been really fantastic. Professor Nepstad, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to forward those to webinar at nonviolentconflict.org. And we will make sure that Professor Nepstad gets those questions, and we will post those questions to our website along with a recording of this webinar. Again, thank you so much, Professor Nepstad. It has been great.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.